Welcome back. In our previous section, we introduced the idea of offer, acceptance, and consideration, focusing on the vendor's offer to sell, an actual quotation. We're going to come back to that story, but before we do that, we want to get into the purchase order details, which really come down to a reflection of the negotiations between the overseas supplier and the U.S. importer. What are all of the terms? Because a purchase order is a legal document at the end of the day. What are the terms under which we as a U.S. importer are willing to make a purchase? We have to capture everything that we're interested in doing that's related to the purchase. The rights and responsibilities between the seller and the buyer. Let's get right down to it. First bullet point, and if you think about it tactically, the entire purchasing function revolves around the purchase order. Purchasing people can't do much if they're not placing purchase orders on vendors overseas. As we've said, when an importer sends a PO to a vendor, that serves as acceptance of the offer to sell. Second bullet, in order to be both legally binding and executable by the supplier, POs have to contain a minimum amount of information. We're going to go way beyond the minimum amount in our examples, so don't worry too much about that. But the real important theme of this section is all PO-specific details are found in the body of the purchase order itself, especially if we as the importer don't have an underlying sales agreement, purchase and sales contract in place with the vendor. As we've said many times, we don't have to have a contract in place. We can use the PO as the contractual document. That's fine. But if we do, make sure we're capturing all of the terms. That's basically what we're getting at in this section. Before we get into the details of the body of a PO, let's stop and talk a little bit about how purchase orders can be sent to vendors. Once again, a U.S. importer to an overseas supplier. Old school way, probably not the best way to do things in this day and age, is by fax. It can work. In fact, going back to as early as the 2000s, that was the predominant way in which POs were sent to vendors. Still happens today. Another, quite common, is via email. It's also not uncommon to see purchase orders designed by importers within a spreadsheet that captures all of the details and sent as an email attachment. Another that is quite common, electronic data interchange, EDI, as we've talked about on many occasions. It's an electronic transmission. There could be electronic messaging via enterprise resource planning software. We have also talked about that. But what is very common in contemporary supply chain management is to send not only purchase orders, but any type of documentation via a SaaS-based import management software program. SaaS being software as a service. An internet-based trading platform, if you will, much like Mercado offers. There are various ways in which to communicate purchase orders, some more advantageous than others. We'll get to that later. Okay, so let's get down to the content of POs. The fields in a well-prepared purchase order should include the following. The header of the document, explicitly stating this is a purchase order. Just like we saw in the quotation, the pro forma invoice that we saw previously, one has to be explicit about what that document is. In the most simplistic of terms, we need the full name and address of the U.S. buyer, the importer, and the full name and address of the vendor. No P.O. boxes allowed in the post-9/11 world. The U.S. importer has to have a sequential P.O. number assigned. If POs are generated by a system, that sequential numbering is going to happen naturally. If a company uses spreadsheets to create POs, that U.S. importer is going to have a manual way to track the generation of those purchase order numbers. Documentation, important to stop here for a quick second. There's so many documents in an international transaction. We've already seen, or at least talked about, two, the quotation from the vendor and a potential purchase order from the buyer. Reference numbers need to be used because out in the business world, there are dozens, if not hundreds of these documents floating around, and one has to be able to keep track of them. You always want to have a sequential PO number on your purchase order. And if a PO is placed based on a quotation from a vendor, we want to reference the original sales quote number from that vendor. We saw the vendor sales quote number in our previous example on the pasta cutting machines coming out of Italy. If we, as the importer in Rochester, New York, are going to place a purchase order, we want to have our own purchase order number, but also reference the sales quote number so everybody knows that we're talking about the same thing. To summarize that point as a trade tip, for matching purposes, match the quote with the purchase order, importers oftentimes reference the original sales quote number received from the overseas supplier. It's not only a trade tip, it's a best practice. Continuing on with the fields that should be included in a purchase order, the vendor number. It's not unusual, in fact, it's quite common for U.S. importers to work with more than one vendor. They have to be assigned a vendor number, especially if that U.S. importer is working in an actual system that generates POs. We have vendor numbers in our item master file, too. Have to have a vendor number. The date of the PO issuance spelled out. Spell out April. Spell out June. We've talked about this before because if we use strictly numbers, 10/12/20, for example, in the United States means October 12th. And almost everywhere else in the world, 10/12/20 means December 10th. So we want to spell out the month. Just a little best practice there. Full name of the purchasing agent, that's the individual person within the U.S. importer that is responsible for buying these goods. So we have good contact information there. Mode of transport, air freight, ocean freight, truck or rail for North American imports. And as a trade tip, again, we will summarize. Spelling out the month and the PO date avoids confusion between month and day. Outside the U.S., the first number is the day and the second number is the month. Pay attention to that. Things can go awry from something as simple as a misunderstanding about dates. Other considerations, the payment terms. 30 days credit from the vendor overseas, or a 40% down payment required, or a letter of credit. You have to have the payment terms there. Of course, the quantities that we want to purchase, the unit of measure. Is it by unit itself, one pasta cutting machine? Or is it by dozen if we're buying socks overseas? Or by drum if we're buying chemicals? We want to have an explicit expression of the unit of measure. Product description, super important. What exactly are we buying? And not only a product description, but perhaps a model number, too. And then the unit price, the price of the item or product at the door of the factory. Not to be confused with landed cost that we've talked about so much. Here's another important trade tip. The product description provided on the PO should be consistent with that provided in a contract or on a sales quote, as well as on the vendor's commercial invoice, should a purchase actually be made. Pasta cutting machine, to go back to our original example. That product description is going to be used throughout the life of the transaction as it appears on other documents, the commercial invoice, the packing list, the bill of lading, etc. What is that information going to be used for later? The product description? Customs clearance in the United States, the ability to classify the product and get goods cleared through the U.S. We want to be consistent from the get-go, starting with the quotation onto the PO, commercial invoice, packing list, BL, customs entry, etc. That's an important trade tip. Last slide in this section. What else should we get on a PO? And you can imagine this must be a pretty big document. But all kidding aside, we want to be able to capture every element of the purchase. What's the total price? Especially if we buy more than one unit, and especially if we negotiate an Incoterm that includes transportation charges, like CIP, which we saw in our pasta cutting machine example. Currency of sale we talked about. Last cancellation date on a PO, super important, especially if an importer realizes that their demand signals are telling them that they need to back off of purchases and either reduce or totally cancel a PO. There has to be a last cancellation date there. Also a last ship date. We as an importer are buying goods for a reason, and one of the reasons is that we need them by a certain time. We have to know the cumulative lead time of every product we buy overseas, a topic we've covered endlessly. And we have to make sure that that lead time requirement is met by stipulating a last ship date. and then a signature of the purchasing agent or authorized party. Trade tip, we talked about this a bit in section 7. Every country signifies its currency using a symbol and or 3 uppercase letters. USD in the case of US dollars, MXP in the case of Mexican pesos, RMB in the case of the Chinese currency, the renminbi. We might want to use that uppercase 3 letters when we place a purchase order. We'll see some of that in just a little bit when we continue with the next section, going over the actual purchase order that was placed on the Italian vendor from the quote we saw for the pasta cutting machine. The excitement is just too much, so come back as quickly as you can.